You know, there's something rather disturbing that happens to people who are spiritually awakening. Everything that used to bring them joy, the activities, the entertainment, the social events, the hobbies, suddenly feels empty. Not just boring, empty. Like going through the motions of something that once mattered but doesn't anymore. And the first thought they have is, something is wrong with me. Am I depressed? Have I lost my capacity to feel pleasure? Did awakening break something essential in me? They watch other people enjoying the same things they used to enjoy, laughing at parties, excited about purchases, engaged with entertainment, and they feel nothing. Just this strange, uncomfortable emptiness where joy used to be. They try to force it. They go to the party and try to have fun. They buy the thing and try to feel excited. They engage in the hobby and try to recapture what it used to give them. But nothing works. The joy isn't there, and they start to panic. What if this emptiness is permanent? What if I've lost my ability to enjoy life? But what if that's completely wrong? What if this loss of joy isn't pathology at all? What if it's actually a sign of profound transformation? What if the old joys had to die so that real joy, something deeper, truer, more sustainable, could emerge? Carl Jung understood this transition better than almost anyone. Throughout his work on individuation, he observed a consistent pattern. As people became more conscious, they lost interest in the pleasures that once satisfied them. Not because they'd become joyless, but because they'd outgrown unconscious pleasure. And there's a gap, often a long, uncomfortable gap, between losing the old joy and discovering the new. And if you're in this gap right now, if nothing brings you joy anymore, and you're terrified this is permanent, you need to keep watching, because what I'm about to tell you will change everything. This isn't depression. This isn't dysfunction. This is what consciousness does to pleasure. It destroys the old so the new can emerge. And understanding what's actually happening, understanding why nothing brings you joy anymore, that's the key to moving through this instead of getting stuck in it. First, let's be very clear about something. This isn't clinical depression. Depression is characterized by inability to feel anything. Not just joy, but also connection, meaning, interest in life itself. Depression is pervasive numbness, hopelessness, inability to function. If that's what someone is experiencing, they need professional help. What we're talking about is something different. The loss of joy in things that used to bring joy, while other aspects of life remain intact. Someone can still feel connection to certain people, can still find meaning in their work, can still function, still engage. They're not numb to everything, just to the specific pleasures that used to work. This distinction is crucial, because if someone misidentifies spiritual transition as depression, they might treat it with medication, when what they actually need is to understand the transition and move through it. The emptiness isn't chemical, it's existential. It's consciousness outgrowing its old sources of pleasure. Now here's what most people miss about why this happens, and understanding this changes everything. Jung talked about how unconscious pleasure works. Before awakening, pleasure comes from feeding the ego. The ego needs certain things to feel good about itself: validation, achievement, acquisition, status, excitement, distraction. And activities that provide these things create pleasure, not because the activities themselves are inherently pleasurable, but because they're feeding unconscious needs. Someone enjoys shopping because it feeds the need for identity through acquisition. Someone enjoys parties because they feed the need for validation. Someone enjoys achievement because it feeds the need to prove worth. The pleasure isn't in the shopping or the party. It's in the unconscious need the activity satisfies. But when someone awakens, these unconscious needs start to dissolve. The ego becomes less demanding. The need for validation decreases. The need to prove worth fades. And suddenly, the activities that used to create pleasure by feeding these needs, they stop working, because the needs they were feeding no longer exist. Here's what's actually happening when nothing brings joy anymore. The pleasures you used to enjoy were feeding an ego structure that's dissolving. You're not losing your capacity for joy. You're losing the unconscious needs that created that particular kind of joy. And without those needs, those pleasures feel empty. Before awakening, someone might love buying new clothes. The pleasure seems to be in the clothes themselves. But actually, the pleasure is in the identity the clothes create, in feeling like someone who has good taste, who can afford nice things. The clothes are feeding an ego need for identity and status. But when that person awakens, when the ego's need for identity through appearance dissolves, buying clothes stops being pleasurable, not because the clothes are less beautiful, but because they're no longer feeding anything. The unconscious hunger that made them satisfying is gone. So the activity feels empty, like eating when you're not hungry. And here's what's crucial. This isn't just about shopping. It's about everything that used to bring joy through feeding the ego. Social events that used to be fun feel exhausting because they were feeding the need for validation. Achievement that used to be satisfying feels hollow because it was feeding the need to prove worth. Entertainment that used to be engaging feels boring because it was feeding the need for distraction. Hobbies that used to be enjoyable feel pointless because they were feeding the need for identity. One by one, as the unconscious needs dissolve, the pleasures built on feeding those needs lose their power, and the person is left standing in this strange emptiness, looking at activities that used to bring joy and feeling nothing, not because they've become incapable of joy, but because the structure that created that kind of joy is dissolving. Jung would say, "This is good. This dissolution is necessary." You can't discover real joy, joy that comes from being rather than from feeding the ego, until the false joy of ego feeding falls away. But understanding that doesn't make the transition less uncomfortable, doesn't answer the question, if these things don't bring joy anymore, what will? Here's another way to understand what's happening. You've outgrown unconscious joy. Unconscious joy is pleasure that comes from satisfying needs you're not aware you have. You think you enjoy the thing itself, but actually you enjoy what the thing does for your ego. You think you like parties, but actually you like the validation. This unconscious joy is powerful. It drives most of human behavior. People organize entire lives around pursuing it. Work jobs they hate to buy things that bring unconscious joy. Maintain relationships that drain them for the unconscious joy of feeling needed. It works until you become conscious. When consciousness develops, when you start seeing your own patterns and motivations, unconscious joy stops working because you can see through it now. You know the party isn't actually fun. You're just seeking validation. You know the achievement doesn't actually satisfy. You're just trying to prove worth. You see the mechanism, and seeing it disrupts it. Now, here's what people don't understand about this transition. And missing this is what creates the panic. When you outgrow unconscious joy, there's a gap before conscious joy emerges. And in that gap, nothing brings pleasure, because the old pleasures don't work anymore, and the new ones haven't revealed themselves yet. You're between worlds, between unconscious joy that's died and conscious joy that hasn't been born. This gap can last months, sometimes years, and during this time, it genuinely seems like you've lost your capacity for joy entirely. You try the old activities and feel nothing. You search for new activities, and they also feel empty. The world feels gray, flat, joyless. And you start to believe this is permanent. But this isn't permanent. This is transition. The old structure of joy is gone. The new structure hasn't formed yet. You're in the uncomfortable space between. And the only way through is through. You can't go back to unconscious joy. You've seen through it. You can't force conscious joy to arrive. It emerges in its own time. Jung called this the dark night of the soul. The period when the old self has died, but the new self hasn't fully emerged. When you've let go of ego-driven existence, but haven't yet discovered self-driven existence. When everything that used to work doesn't work anymore, and nothing new has arrived to replace it. It's dark, it's uncomfortable, and it's absolutely necessary. Most people can't tolerate this void. They try to escape it by going back to the old pleasures, forcing themselves to enjoy things they have outgrown. Or they try to fill it with new pleasures, frantically searching for something, anything that will make them feel good again. Or they pathologize it, deciding they're depressed and need to be fixed, anything to avoid sitting in the emptiness. And if you're in this void right now and need guidance on how to navigate it, check out our guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get it and learn how to be with the emptiness until the new joy emerges. But Jung would say, the void is necessary. You can't rush through it, can't skip it, can't fill it artificially. The death of the old and the birth of the new require this space between. This emptiness is where the transformation actually happens, not in the dramatic moments of realization, but in the quiet, uncomfortable space of not knowing what brings joy anymore. The mistake people make is thinking the void is the problem, that the emptiness needs to be fixed, but the void isn't the problem. The void is the process. It's where the ego dissolves and the self emerges. It's where unconscious joy dies and conscious joy is born. Fighting the void keeps people stuck. Accepting it allows movement through it. This doesn't mean being passive. It means continuing to engage with life even when engagement doesn't bring pleasure. Showing up even when showing up doesn't feel good. Living even when living feels empty. And trusting that this emptiness is making space for something you can't imagine yet. Something that's being born in the darkness. So what does joy look like on the other side of this transition? What replaces the unconscious pleasures that have fallen away? Jung discovered something remarkable. Conscious joy is completely different from unconscious joy. It doesn't come from feeding the ego. It comes from being aligned with the self. Conscious joy is quieter than unconscious joy, less dramatic, less intense. It's not the high of getting what you want or the thrill of achievement. It's more like deep satisfaction, like rightness, like being exactly where you're supposed to be. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It just is. Steady, reliable, real. And it comes from completely different sources, not from activities that feed the ego, but from activities that express the self, not from getting something external, but from being something internal. Someone might find conscious joy in simple presence, in sitting quietly without agenda, in being fully here, fully now. But here's what's crucial about conscious joy. And missing this is why people give up before it arrives. This would have bored the ego to death, but the self finds it profoundly satisfying. Someone might find conscious joy in creating something meaningful, not for recognition or achievement, but because the creating itself is an expression of who they are. The ego wouldn't have bothered without the reward, but the self does it because it's right. Conscious joy doesn't announce itself. You don't suddenly feel flooded with pleasure and realize, oh, this is the new joy. It emerges so gradually, so quietly, that you might not notice it for a long time. You're doing something and you realize, I'm enjoying this, not in the intense way you remember, but in a deeper, quieter way. A way that doesn't depend on getting anything or proving anything. A way that comes from being aligned with what's real in you. And once you start noticing it, you realize it's been there for a while, growing, deepening, becoming more consistent than the old pleasures ever were. The old joy was peaks and valleys, intense highs when you got what you wanted, crashing lows when you didn't. But conscious joy is steady. It doesn't depend on outcomes. It comes from alignment, from authenticity, from being who you actually are rather than who the ego thought you should be. So what do you actually do when nothing brings you joy anymore? When you're in the void between old and new? Jung would say, keep living, keep engaging, keep showing up. But stop trying to force pleasure. Stop demanding that activities feel good. Stop measuring your life by whether things bring joy. Instead, ask a different question. Not, does this bring me pleasure? But, is this aligned with who I'm becoming? Not, does this feel good? But, is this real? Not, does this satisfy the ego? But, does this express the self? The questions themselves shift you from seeking unconscious joy to allowing conscious joy to emerge. And be patient. The void has its own timeline. You can't rush the transformation, can't force the new joy to arrive, can't skip the uncomfortable period of emptiness. You can only be with it, accept it, trust that it's doing something essential, even though you can't see what. Some people are in the void for months, some for years. There's no standard timeline, but everyone who goes through it and doesn't go back eventually emerges, eventually discovers that joy hasn't been lost. It's been transformed from unconscious pleasure to conscious satisfaction, from ego-driven to self-driven. And that transformation is what real awakening looks like. If nothing brings you joy anymore, you're not broken. You're transitioning. The old pleasures that fed your ego have stopped working. The new joy that comes from self hasn't emerged yet. You're in the uncomfortable gap between false and real, between unconscious and conscious. And in this gap, everything feels empty. Not because you've lost your capacity for joy, but because the old capacity has dissolved and the new one hasn't formed yet. The structure that created pleasure through feeding the ego is gone. The structure that creates joy through being aligned with self is being born. And birth requires this space, this emptiness, this void. Jung would tell you, don't panic, don't pathologize, don't try to go back to what doesn't work anymore, and don't try to force what hasn't arrived yet. Just be in the void. Accept the emptiness. Trust the process. Keep living even when living doesn't bring pleasure, because the emptiness is temporary, the transformation is real, and on the other side is a kind of joy you can't imagine yet, deeper than the old pleasures, more reliable than ego satisfaction, more real than anything you've known. You haven't lost joy. You've outgrown false joy, and real joy is coming. Quietly, in its own time, when the void has done its work. Welcome to the transition. Welcome to the emptiness that precedes fullness. Welcome to the death that precedes birth. Nothing brings you joy anymore, not because something is wrong, but because something is becoming right. Trust it. Be with it. Wait for what's emerging. The new joy is worth the void.